So thanks everybody for joining. I'm Patrick Garrity, security researcher and evangelist here at VulnCheck. And today we're going to be diving into one of my favorite topics, exploring vulnerability exploitation beyond CISA KEV. And it's going to be a super fun time. I dropped some research today we'll probably talk a little bit about as well. Appreciate your patience. As I kind of mentioned, this is our first time doing a roundtable and trying to multi-stream. I would say multi-stream, but LinkedIn Live isn't working. So we're here on Zoom, and we'll have a YouTube recording afterwards for people that we'll send out as well. During today's roundtable, I would highly recommend use the chat. It should be open. Let me just double check that. So everyone can chat. If someone wants to throw an emoji or say hi, that would be great, just so we know that's working. Feel free to engage that way, which will be awesome. And I guess we can get started. So first, to kick it off, I'd like to introduce Anthony Bettini, founder and CEO at VulnCheck. Hey, Sam. Anthony, this is his third company, VulnCheck, founding in the security space. Prior to that, there was a company, FlawCheck, a container security startup focused on Docker that was acquired by Tenable. And then Anthony's first startup, Authority, was a mobile security startup that was acquired by Symantec. And one of the reasons I joined VulnCheck was due to our shared love for collecting vulnerabilities with known exploitation. So welcome, Anthony. Thanks so much for joining and sharing your perspective.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Patrick. Really great to be doing our first webinar with you, and excited you all are here to attend.
Yeah, that's great. Well, cool. And I'm excited to geek out on exploitation today as well. And then we also have Jacob Bain, CTO at VulnCheck, joining our discussion. Jake's a three-time DEF CON speaker, has spoken at Black Hat, contributed to Metasploit, vulnerability researcher, blogger, and you've disclosed over 100 CVEs. Quite the impressive resume there. So thanks for joining. Appreciate having you on.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, CVs, that's just a number, but I'm glad to have a platform to give my bad opinions and make everyone listen to it.
What's the best CVE? What are you most proud of?
One of my favorite CVEs is an old WebLogic one, which was one of my first deserialization ones. I think it was from 2016, but it was like the first time I popped something that was like widely deployed on the internet. That's always a favorite. Cool.
That sounds pretty impressive and exciting. And I mean, that's I don't know, 8 years ago, I think. So that's pretty cool. Awesome. So we're going to be hopping into exploitation a bit. Kind of purpose of this discussion, right, is we're going to talk about a little bit about known exploitation. Towards the end, we'll talk more about, we launched a product yesterday in a little bit deeper detail, but I think we're going to meander in a lot of different topics before we get there. It's not meant to be a sales pitch, more meant to, really discuss exploitation as a whole, which I'm super excited about. As we discussed. So towards the end, I think we'll get in more detail as we go through. But first off, want to start off with Anthony and talk about, the role that one of my favorite government projects ever, has played, and that's CISA's known exploited vulnerability catalog. So Anthony, curious to get your perspective on what role you've seen the CISA KEV play in VM.
Yeah, I think it's been enormously helpful. Frankly, nothing like CISA KEV at the time CISA KEV was launched, nothing like it really existed publicly available to the community. And I think it was generally well received. And I think on the security side of it, it's actually caused real material changes, like the binding operational directive around notification of exploited vulnerabilities and this whole notion of due dates on patching, I think really is driving the community in the right direction. And it caused a downstream effect of, people in the defense industrial base and further along in the community, have started paying attention to exploited vulnerabilities and remediating kind of on the same timelines. So I think it's been a huge win for the community.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the interesting aspect, the bidirectional operative aspect, I'm always pushing CISA. It's we need more of these, right? More more like no questions asked, everyone should be doing it. And certainly the KEV is one of those where you just, I mean, it's super simple. It's really important that people take action and actually remediate exploited vulnerabilities. So how has CISA KEV catalog helped in identifying and mitigating potential threats for organizations even outside the federal space?
I think one part of it is, and I'm noticing we have a question from the audience as well. I'll get to that in a second, but I think one thing outside of government is, whenever the government moves in a certain direction, they're the largest buyers of IT in general, and so it causes a follow-on effect of people who either think they need to comply or do actually need to comply or just simply want to out of goodwill. So I think, or expect they may be regulated towards complying in the future. So I think that it causes a knock-on effect of a lot of people start paying attention to the CISA KEV list, start paying attention to what's exploited in the wild and how can they remediate it faster. And certainly because it's a much smaller list, a lot easier to do that than with, say, like CVSS-based scores where, 40% of the vulnerabilities have higher critical ratings.
Yeah, I mean, it's at this point with so many vulnerabilities, right? It's hard to make any sense of using CVSS base score for prioritization. So, I'm kind of curious, like, to get more your perspective on CISA KEV, and I think one of the good questions too is what do you see in the future? But what are some of the limitations or challenges you've observed as it relates to CISA KEV?
Yeah, I think, I guess the challenges I'll take it in kind of two ways, but they're of course related is, us ourselves using it and what we hear from customers on challenges they may have with it. Sometimes I think it's a little hard in that this isn't specific to CISA KEV, it's more like specific to sources in general, but when there aren't citations or references, like if there isn't an evidence trail of like why it's in the list, I think that's sometimes it's hard for people to digest, especially when you tell them like it's an emergency, go remediate and do that immediately. And I think that's sometimes difficult because, not all emergencies are of equal severity. Sometimes the exploitation is widespread, or in some cases it's just getting started. And it's a hard thing to manage that balance. But I think the lack of evidence or the lack of references doesn't call into question the data, but it makes it a little bit harder to work with of like, hey, what time do I want to spend on this, and why should I do that like under the gun of an emergency? I think another thing that's challenging, in the case of CISA KEV, sometimes actually CVEs show up on the KEV list. They're still marked as reserved in NVD. And so, like it may have a CVE assigned to it, but you go to look up more information and then you get this reserved CVE page on the NIST side. So I think, and even if it's not reserved, most times it isn't, you still, as a defender, still have this question of like, well, how do I go remediate, and what action do I really go take? And do I how do I remediate, say, my container or my VM? Like what do I actually go do? And that's of course not included. But I think because remediation data in general is a little difficult, it's certainly a challenge people face. And so they start researching these vulnerabilities. They start Googling other sources. They start trying to figure out like, what does it mean to me? And so, I think that's one of the challenges. That's why in the VulnCheck KEV case, we try to link back to public exploit POCs and references to exploitation, so that on the references side, people can know like why it's included in the first place. And on the exploit POC side, people can know like, hey, if I'm going to go build some detection or mitigation for this, what does it need to go block, and what can I test it against?
That's great. So question, we are going to hop into POCs, right? I think twofold. One of my questions, right, is how often are we finding vulnerabilities, in our systems that aren't listed in KEV? And I know personally, I think me and it was Yotam Perkel, a friend of mine last summer, like we were just finding CVEs and throwing them over the fence. And many of them got added, but some of them did not for certain reasons. Like maybe the technology didn't have that much prevalence in federal, I don't know, or it didn't have a mitigation and patch. So I'm kind of curious, like what have you observed or seen in relation to known exploited vulnerabilities beyond that are on KEV these days?
Yeah, I would say there's probably at least two things I'd mention that I think of as interesting. One is that the binding operational directive that the CISA KEV list operates under really is mandated around helping the government speed up remediation and patching and applying mitigating controls that have been recommended by vendors. And so if there is no patch, if there is no vendor provided remediation guidance, it won't get added to the CISA KEV list because there's no due date that can be wired into taking no action. But that doesn't mean exploitation is not happening. Vulnerabilities could be exploited in the wild, even if there's no patch, and that could be happening in a widespread fashion. And so when we were designing the coverage criteria for Vulnerabilities KEV, we intentionally do not have a requirement around there is some patch or there is some mitigating control, because ultimately there's always a mitigation. You can remove the software, you can unplug the appliance, you can always take some action. Doesn't mean there are enjoyable actions to take or that there aren't trade-offs, but there's always some action that could be taken. And so we certainly firmly believe that if there's evidence of exploitation out there, then we should report that to people and they can use their own judgment on it. In terms of the numbers, I would say that's another kind of difference. We cast a very wide net on trying to figure out all the places that report exploitation in the wild. And the end result of doing that is we detect and report on about 80% more CVEs as exploited in the wild relative to the CISA KEV list. And also, since we're doing that generally in software, it tends to pick up vulnerabilities earlier before they get added to the CISA KEV list.
Hey, that's awesome. Before we hop into more details on the exploit side, I think one of the exciting things you can talk about it, but we made a big announcement yesterday as far as community edition, where we're giving some of this away. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I would say, we're all in the cybersecurity community, and I think the longer you're in that community, the more small you realize it is. Like if you show up at a conference, you'll run into people or years go by, you see the same people just at different employers. I think cybersecurity in that sense is a little different. Like it is a little bit of its own community, and ultimately we're up against an adversary or a large number of adversaries. And so, we've decided to make a conscious decision as a business to have a community tier that's perpetually free, that continues to add more and more value over time. And we launched, this is a while back now, but we had launched Vulnercheck XDB, which was an index of publicly available exploit POCs. We had launched NVD 1.0 to kind of perpetually support that, even though NIST was deprecating it. And then with yesterday's announcement, we announced the Vulnercheck KEV list, which we're going to support perpetually, and it's free, doesn't cost anyone anything. It's even free to bundle within products. We just asked there's attribution back to Vulnercheck. But yeah, we launched it for the community, and we're real excited to have a lot more users on the platform and giving feedback on what we're up to and building integrations against Vulnercheck.
Cool. So we'll dive deeper into that I think before we go there, so everyone knows, like, you can go to vulncheck.com/kev and just sign up, and you have access to the JSON API as well as some other stuff we'll show you in the dashboard later, which will be great. But before we go there, I want to talk about a little bit deeper on the exploitation side. And Jake, you spent a lot of time in the world of exploitation and exploit development. And I think this is another big reason, other than collecting a bunch of known exploited vulnerabilities. For me, one of the reasons I came here is I think gaining visibility more into the intelligence side of how people are thinking about exploitation and exploit development. And so I'd love to get your perspective on where organizations should focus once they have addressed vulnerabilities with known exploitation, because that's very common is, hey, I covered all my CISA KEVs. Now that you can say, hey, I covered all my VulnCheck KEVs, but what else do I need to be considering? What I need to do next?
I mean, first of all, that's super impressive if you're able to actually cover all those in the first place. That's a great place to be. And it's sort of a challenge to decide, what do I prioritize next? I personally would like you're suggesting, think about exploits. Specifically, my bread and butter has always been initial access exploits. But this is a way I kind of think about it is, there are varying levels of maturity of exploits, but there are like open source projects that have mature exploits. Like Metasploit has mature exploits that will drop from interpreter. If Metasploit has an exploit for a CVE that is not in either of these lists, it's a very good candidate for being in the list in the future, assuming it's an initial access exploit. Additionally, like something like Nuclei, like they have a whole lot of scanners that cover CVEs that are not in either of our lists. But those are great candidates to patch as well because people are scanning the entire internet with Nuclei all the time. So yeah, those are the two places I would start with weaponized exploits and exploits or scanners that people are going to be using.
Someone kind of mentioned Rivendra, and sorry, LinkedIn didn't work, but Nuclei is the best, is what they said. So, yeah, that's really good advice, and I think the aspect of starting that outward, I think asset ties to that too. When we do talk about like, hey, go fix all your known exploited vulnerabilities, like, yeah, definitely use some asset context to prioritize the ones that are externally and internet facing, as you're approaching that. So question though, like beyond the edge devices and initial access, like what other categories do you find are most concerning to you?
Yeah, so I'm gonna reference a visual slide that we don't have at the moment, so that's really useful for a webinar. Anthony likes to show this slide. I believe it's from RSA last year that describes like the way people are getting breached nowadays. And number one right now is like initial access, and number two is phishing. Phishing often occurs via client-side attacks. And by client-side, I mean like you clicked a link and your browser got owned, or you opened a Word doc and it was actually like Felina exploiting your system. So those are very concerning because they are in their own way an initial access vector. It just takes some user interaction. So yeah, that is an area that you also have to be concerned. Like I said, my bread and butter is things on the edge, but it's well documented that attackers are throwing things like Felina into Word docs and getting people to open them.
I think it's an interesting perspective because I haven't heard that from a lot of people, right? I think it gets overlooked, right? It's like, oh, it's just an end user device. Certainly they're focused on their Windows patching and patching other things, but yeah, I often also see a lot of organizations, especially if you dip into like healthcare, that are kind of playing a blind eye because they have out-of-date applications, right, that are reliant on out-of-date packages more or less. So curious, like what other considerations do you think VM teams should be thinking about as they're, approaching prioritization remediation strategy overall.
Yeah, I'd go back out to the edge again because that's where I live and I'm happy. One of the biggest issues we see with CVE for edge devices in KEV and VC KEV is basically that these are like admin interfaces that are on the internet and they don't belong there. They should have never been there. So a great example is like 6L routers. That's one I've been looking at recently. There's like 30,000 of those admin interfaces on the internet. There's no real reason for that. So those and so the reason I was looking at that was because, I'm tracing out a botnet that, lives on those devices. So it's sort of a big deal to have stuff like that out there. And additionally, another vulnerability I've been working on recently has been in Confluence. And, something like Confluence has been on KEV, so, I forget if it's like 7 or 8 times now. Like, you need to start wondering if that's something you want on the internet in the first place. You put that behind a VPN and still use Confluence.
Yeah, like a
So,
sorry, no comment. I was gonna say another device that's been on the KEV a lot.
yeah, but it's just you got to be really cognizant of like what is actually externally facing. I know that can be very difficult, but to me it's super important because that's people are throwing exploits over the internet, pivoting inwards, and then your entire systems are inwards.
I think we're just starting to on the known exploitation side to get some historicals. Like the KEV only the KEV has only been around for 2 years, I think, as of this past November. So like it's not a lot of historical data. But yeah, as we keep on seeing these same product lines just land there over and over again, month after month, like you got to start. Yeah, there's some aspect to be said of like, yeah, there's pervasiveness, right? But then there's the aspect of, hey, is this built securely? Is this product we want, as you kind of mentioned, on the internet? Which is a great perspective. So, hey, diving a little bit more, like, help me understand the, in others, the exploit POC side. So I think the reason why I ask, right, is a lot of times, like, I think defenders or red teams a lot of times will be using these different tools. So they have a good understanding, but a lot of times, like as I've worked with enterprise VM teams, it's just a data point to them. So I think it'd be useful or helpful to get your perspective on like, how you look at exploit or POC to leverage and use that information and making a decision, because there's so much information out there nowadays.
Sure, there are a lot of ways I could approach this one. I'll try to approach it one way, and you can redirect me if I'm way off. One of the reasons I think tracking all the POCs is really important is because the minute one POC is available, you will have a couple dozen to hundreds of people like grabbing that POC, crafting it into like whatever platform they want, whether that be Nuclei, whether that be their own Python POC, and start scanning the internet and start eating that at, live systems. And so tracking POC is kind of like being able to understand when something is about to blow up, sort of. So from like someone who is interested in what threats are coming next, it's like, okay, you see the one POC, and then the next day there's 5 of them, and then the next day there's 15 of them. And it just like tracking that's very important to understand what's going on. I will say additionally, like these POCs are very useful for defenders because you can use. I know when I did more defensive stuff, they were very helpful in like figuring out like how to test different systems. But it's a cuts both ways type thing. Like attackers can use it. They're more interested in that type of thing. So I think it's good like someone like us collects them on one centralized location and shares them.
And Patrick, this now might be a good time to show your slide to see like the evolution of the timeline we see on exploitation nowadays, because I think it echoes Jake's comment a moment ago, where like one exploit POC tends to mean we see a bunch more coming soon.
Yeah. Make sure I'm not muted. Hey, I'm not. That's a good one. So yeah, I think this is the slide you're referring to, right? Where I
Yeah.
mocked up and this is post known exploitation, if you think of it that way, right?
Mm.
Um I kind of highlighted here as I was outlining and for my own analysis, right? It's like I spent, if you know who I am, Patrick Garrity on LinkedIn, like I spent almost a year just like literally spending all my life on the KEV doing data analysis. And so for me, what's interesting is like, you know, I'm like, hey, I want to take a CV and I want to look at it since we're offering our free version, community version of the KEV. And this is, I mean, what's pretty amazing. I feel like an infomercial here, kind of laughing, but for me, it's like, oh wow, now I can actually extract out a full timeline of the exploitation that's going on with this, and realizing how fast it's happening. And I think this is one of many examples. There's many examples with like 200 different sources that are the initial visibility, but this particular one, what I found interesting is it's like, hey, you have a Twitter account, the DFIR report, you know, where it was reported. The day after, you have Shadow Server obviously spun up a honeypot, and now they're actually detecting that there's active exploitation. Oh, by the way, on the 17th there was a POC, so 4 days earlier, right? And then subsequently, like you kind of mentioned, Jake, like pile on the POCs, like next day, three GitHub exploits, or same day as the Shadow Server honeypot went live and started detecting traffic. And then Sans talks about all this cool stuff, and then catch on Twitter. Then you have some, you know, mentioned by Tenable and an advisory, and it kind of just like dovetails. And on the 24th, you have the CISA KEV disclosure, right? So I could rant about this one, but I'm curious to hear your perspectives on like anything that stood out to you guys.
So I was looking at this today because you know, as part of our analysis of XDB GitHub things, it's like we actually read the POCs. And I'd come across one of these POCs that was written by a Chinese developer. And what it did was it loaded the Godzilla web shell in memory, which is a super sweet exploit. And that was loaded. That was like maybe the February 2nd exploit. Anyways, that's why I was looking at it. So we're like up to like 30 different exploits for this one now, but that includes like blogs and stuff. And I think the first disclosure was actually before exploitation. I think Project Discovery disclosed this on like the 20th or 19th of January in a blog. You know, my experience is a lot of these are like, it's not always the case, but a lot of those times, like someone finds it, says this is how what it is, and then, you know, a few days later, you get this exact timeline.
It's great. So it sounds like there's opportunity to get ahead of this a bit further, which I think is like, that's probably one of the biggest things I hear when I'm talking to practitioners is like, yeah, this stuff is coming so fast and quick. How do I buy more time? Is one of the common things. And I think out of this weekend, I was reading Palo Alto research reports that had CVEs that are exploited, and yeah, it was even interesting to read some of the reports where it's like, yeah, on average, some of these new vulnerabilities are being mass exploited within like 48-hour timelines nowadays. Yeah, I think I don't know if you mentioned this or if it was the reports I was reading. I'm mixed so much because I consume so much information this week. But yeah, I think part of that is like, do they have the infrastructure to be able to go execute, and is it the right exploit? Is that part of what's going on in relation to what gets mass exploited?
I think it's part of it. Like, just so many people have available workflows. Like this is, I already know, like if I wanted to, we do internet scanning, and like I in particular do a bunch. And so like if I wanted to scan for Confluence, I could have a scan up and running in, you know, 10 minutes from now. So if I have an exploit for Confluence, it just like take 10, 15 minutes to integrate a known exploit in there. no problem. I think that's basically what you're seeing. Like, a lot of these things are getting exploited over and over again. The infrastructure is already there for doing this stuff. So yeah, it makes it so easy to just like plug and play.
Yeah. I'm excited to, I mean, I just joined a month ago, but it's like diving into some of the data between the KEV, the Vulnerability KEV, and then some of our commercial intelligence. It's like, yeah, it's really interesting to look at, like, some different threat actors, some different technologies. I think someone on LinkedIn commented that I should look at Citrix NetScaler today, which is a interesting one from my perspective. And then I always joke that, like, it seems like some of this is correlating with private equity firms, but a lot of it's technology that's been around for 20, 30 years, right? And so I think that's some of the challenge in making sure that things get to a more secure state. So hey, in relation to exploits, right? So like what we find them in a lot more than just GitHub. So I think people are familiar, generally speaking, with like GitHub exploits, nuclei exploits, Metasploit. But help me understand, like, where else are we finding exploits or seeing exploitation, like exploit availability?
Yeah. So just to be clear, Vulnercheck Kev only contains XDB links, and XDB links are only for GitHub, GitLab, and Gitee, which is like the Chinese GitHub. I will say, just to level set, like most exploits that we see are published on GitHub nowadays. That's like the primary place people are publishing. So it's great that we aggregate that. But we find exploits in a ton of different places. Researcher blogs, LinkedIn, Twitter, Mastodon, the places you would expect. But some weirder places like developer issues, they'll just like, oh, this is how I would exercise this bug, and it's actually like a real POC. Just snippets on GitLab, um, uh, obviously the traditional ones like exploit DB, 0-day today, those are really kind of dying, but they do update regularly. What am I forgetting, Tony?
I mean, Packet Storm would be the oldest one.
Yeah. But yeah, wherever there are basically developers or researchers talking about code, it generally devolves into like exploit discussion and how to exercise a bug, and we generally try to find all those locations.
And Patrick, also, I think, Jake had mentioned exploiting the bugs faster because of existing infrastructure. I think that's another thing that maybe is not always intuitive to people because, I think for many years they've thought of like, hey, the latest 0-day, the price is costing more and more, and people are buying them, and there's a market for 0 days, and that's all true. But if you imagine the threat actor side of that story, would they rather pay $500,000 for a bug, or would they just rather see a confluence disclosure and pick it off the top of the queue and just shove it into their existing infrastructure? Certainly they'd prefer the latter because there's no cost at all. And so I think that's why, even in the RSA keynote, you saw exploitation of known vulnerabilities move to the top of the list, because there's a real incentive to do that, but do it quicker than people remediate. And because of all of the internet scanning infrastructure the threat actors have already built up, it's very cheap for them to do that from a cost and time perspective.
Yeah, I saw Stephen Shaver's comment. Definitely an opportunity to iterate and add POC dates on the visuals. Yeah, I mean, the whole intention of that visual to show what we're giving away for free. And then, yeah, I think there's opportunity to back in the longer timeline leading up to when we know there's exploitation, which will be super helpful for people. And then I think my other question on the POC side of things, and these are genuinely a lot of questions I just have because I haven't worked on this side of the fence, right? It's a lot of fun. But in regards to like fidelity of a POC, Jake, I think you've kind of mentioned that, like, yeah, there's a lot of scams. Ability to target maybe researchers. I think Google and Microsoft have been talking about that quite often. What's your experience with like the fidelity of POCs and the risks when you're playing around with them?
Yeah, so we actually sit down and read all of the XDB links and validate that they're like proper exploits. We have a blog, I forget if it was a year ago or a year and a half ago because time is meaningless. We have a blog about someone that was no, thanks, Anthony, that dropped some malware into a POC. I forget how subtle it was because I've looked at so many of these. Some are very subtle, some are like very obvious, but like, yeah, you can't just download it and run it because you are a target and you need to sit down and read it, which can be hard, right? Especially people in industry basically like to use Python, but there are all sorts of different languages that we see. Yeah, so that's a challenge, but there's also this like we come across so many exploits that are just like Bitcoin scams or just don't do what they say they're supposed to do, or like don't reference the same CVE, and all that stuff comes down to like the quality of your data at the end of the day and like how trustworthy it is. So that's one of the reasons we put human eyes on all of those Git repositories, because it is just random people on the internet. One of the nice things about something like Exploit DB, like back in the day, is they were doing all that work and centralizing the data, but now it's just like chaos. So we're trying to fill that gap.
Hey, and then the other question, right, is like before, like how frequently is a patch are exploits like before a patch is available versus after a patch is available?
That's a great question. And I would say it depends entirely on the vendor and how badly the disclosure process went, I think. Um, I don't have a quantifying number for you, but obviously it happens regularly. Was it Avanti all through January that had multiple CVEs with POCs? But before they were able to get a patch out or even mitigations out. So it does happen. I would not say it's like the most regular thing, but you can expect it, monthly or so. Did you have any insights on that, Anthony?
No, I would just say that, it's exactly what you imply, but I'd say the reason, for the fuzziness is just the volume. Like nowadays, there's almost 250,000 vulnerabilities that have CVEs assigned, and the volume is so high, anything you want to zoom in on, there's going to be edge cases, in edge cases that are like widely known and popular. And so just because the volumes are so high. But I think, vast majority of cases, there's a patch available at the time of disclosure. But, whatever percent it is where that's not the case, is definitely a very visible, painful occurrence that we all live with regularly.
Certainly. Hey, so we're gonna I think now we're gonna shift topics. We're gonna shift back to Vulnerability KEV. So I think meaningful discussion on the POC side, exploit side. I think from my perspective, and hopefully everyone else found that helpful. But we wanted to, we have about 15-20 minutes left. Not that we need to spend all our time on that. We can really open it up for questions as well during this. But we're going to spend 2 or 3 minutes and just show everyone the new Vulnerability KEV community offering that's available to everyone. So you want to share your screen and we can kind of hop through?
Yeah, sure. 1 second.
Yeah, and just so everyone knows on the call, right, is we are, wait, someone says don't want to derail. That means we absolutely need to address the question. A lot of this manual analysis and the scale of the vuln problem begs the question, do you see a role for generative AI in solving some of these scale problems? That's the second time someone's asked that question today. Sorry. That's for you. I'm sorry I'm laughing.
Do you want to take it, Anthony? You know my position.
I'll go for it. Where to start? I think generative AI is awesome for a lot of stuff. I think it's applied to a lot more problems than it is an awesome solution for. And so, is it useful for some aspects of the the vuln management, vuln intelligence, kind of space? I'm sure it definitely is. I mean, no doubt on that. Is it gonna massively move the needle and like replace NVD or these kinds of like large tasks, or like will it even just reprioritize all the vulns for you inside your large enterprise? I certainly don't think so. But I think there's lots of places you could use it. We've used it so far today for a really niche use case, frankly. We use it to translate some foreign vulnerability content, and it's done an awesome job of that. But if I was running like a SOC team or a VM team at an enterprise, would I let it reprioritize all my vulns and patch based on that? I would not.
I think that's been similar to my experience. It's like I can direct it to purposely build scripts to go do stuff with vuln data, but the second I start, giving it vuln data, the responses tend to, and I'm not an expert in this area, right? But the responses tend to be mixed. And you have to go and validate the work. So certainly, like not saying there's not opportunity there, but that's kind of what I've seen and experienced from my perspective too. Hey, there are a few more questions, and then we'll let you. There was one more,
sure.
I think. I appreciate if you could answer this question by the end of the session. I'm preparing for junior web pen test role. That should be an interesting one. Which is practical round where company will give me box and I find. I don't know if we have an answer. Sorry, I don't know. I don't understand that question completely. So maybe that was a bad question to ask.
Oh, it's fine. I mean, there's no bad questions to ask. Maybe bad
No, I
answers.
mean me asking you. I'm like, I don't
Oh,
understand it. Is what I meant. Maybe I need to read it better, but I don't know. Ravindra, we'll get back with you offline on that one. I'm just not sure. It's not clear what the question is. So, all right. Hey, yeah, if you want to hop in.
yeah. I'll just
Sidebar.
highlight a few things, and we won't spend too much time on the demo, but just highlight a few things. The first is you can just go to vulncheck.com. I'm currently logged in, but if I wasn't, this instead of saying dashboard, it would say, sign in, join the community. But you also can just click down here, join the Vulncheck community. And then you can either OAuth with Google or put in an email address. It sends you an email, and then you click the login link. Once you log in, this is the dashboard. This is showing CISA KEV vulnerabilities over time, Vulncheck KEV vulnerabilities over time. And then this is how many are in Vulncheck KEV today, like 1972. How many are in CISA KEV, 1082. And you can either click on this or you can click Browse Vulncheck KEV. And so if you click Browse Vulncheck KEV, you get an index of different vulnerabilities in Vulncheck KEV. And then this one, the recent ConnectWise vulnerability, you can see there's Vulncheck XDB references, like our index of Git-hosted exploit POCs. And on the commercial side, we also have initial access and intelligence coverage for this CVE. And so if you click into it, then this is basically an HTML rendering of what's in Vulncheck KEV, the JSON.
Hey, I'm gonna caveat here too. If you got into the product yesterday, this didn't exist. That's how quickly like we're reiterating on this, as far as all the detail. But it wasn't until I think last night or this morning where you would see all this additional info filled in, which is great.
Yeah, I would say, we're a software company like many other software companies. We iterate. We want people to use the service. We want people to like it. We're making continuous improvements, and that's day in, day out. And you should expect to see more of that. And so, like taking this example, another thing we have in the portal, the community edition, we have this API sandbox. And So far, we have 2 indexes available to the community, NIST NVD1, like our perpetually supported NVD 1.0 edition, and then VulnCheck KEV. And then you can browse these like in the API sandbox. You also, of course, can make API calls, and I'll show the docs page in a minute.
Hey, one second
Oh,
as
yes.
we're going, we got some good questions coming in.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So we have a feature request. I love to do this to product. Clint, I see you're on in the comments, but someone asked like, hey, can I do order date latest first? Like sort stuff. And then there's not any sorts today. It goes in the way that it is today from a top bottom perspective. And then Terrence, sorry, I shouldn't say names. This is in questions, not comments. I thought it was comments. I guess it says open. But the question about is the dashboard come along with a subscription? Everything we're showing here is available to anyone that is a VulnCheck community member. And as just showing, all you need to do is sign up for an account. There's no subscription that you have to be able to access this. So
Right, yeah, there's no cost. Another thing I would say is using the API, you can sort by different parameters. In this case, it's sorting by timestamp. And you can apply, maybe I should say a better way to say it is you can apply filters, like you can choose by a last modified time or when it was added. And then so these are the records, and you can paste these right into a browser and start calling it that way. Because there's a session token in the cookie, and so you can just paste the URL right into a browser and start making calls outside of the sandbox. We also make offline backups available, so you can get basically a complete copy of the VulnCheck KEV by just copying and pasting this URL or making a request to the API and then calling the URL supplied by the URL, or you can just click the download backup button and it will download a copy. So that way you can play around with the VulnCheck KEV like locally on your own system. We also have a docs page that jumps you over to docs.vulncheck.com, and this is public, doesn't require any authentication. And then you can click on VulnCheck KEV, and it talks about, jump over to here, like how we decide for adding something to VulnCheck KEV, a description of the schema or fields, an attribution notice in the case of building VulnCheck KEV into your security product, an FAQ of questions we've been asked so far that we wanted to put the answers in the community as well. And then these are the documented API calls. So in other words, you can call like v3 index VulnCheck KEV and start browsing the VulnCheck KEV, paging through the results, or you can call v3 backup VulnCheck KEV and just download a copy of VulnCheck KEV locally. So that's kind of what we've announced so far for the community, and we're real excited about VulnCheck KEV. We think it'll make a material difference. More vulnerabilities covered faster and then linked back to exploit POCs so people can start building detections. And certainly hope you all give it a try. And if you have feedback, feature requests, and so on, we would love to hear that. Can engage a wide range of different ways.
hey, and that question, so the API endpoint, like if you just change exploits with VulnCheck KEV, I think, is that the URL endpoint?
You would just change. I mean, I can reshare my screen real quick. That's no big deal.
Yep.
So I guess let's jump to the sandbox.
I mean, we might, yeah, right there is the URL.
Right.
On the right.
Yeah. So you can just hit the copy paste button, URL copy to clipboard, and then just paste it in. But it would be a v3 index VulnCheck KEV.
Yep. And then if you want to hit the backup, you would just change the index to the word backup.
Yeah, exactly. And I can just show that live.
Hopefully that helps Alex and others as well. So cool. This has been awesome. So I think just to remind everyone, right? This is a community resource, so it's available to anyone. You can go to vulnercheck.com/kev and access it today. If you do have any questions or need any help, like, don't hesitate to reach out to us, support at vulnercheck.com. You can also hit me up on LinkedIn. We're always open for feedback as well, as we're rolling out this product. And then, I think we can open up if there's any other questions, and then any other comments or feedback that Anthony or Jake, you want to say before we hop off?
Not really. I'm like, releasing Vulnercheck KEV was one of the things Anthony and I talked about a couple years ago now, and I'm really excited that it's out in the community and like super proud of it, and really excited to see people use it and provide feedback.
Yeah, I'm excited to get some feedback. So I think anyone that's trying it, please let us know. I think it'll be interesting to see too what people discover within their environment. So please share. If you're not comfortable with sharing the world, just send a note to us, or dropping us in an email or LinkedIn, as we always love to get in here feedback, which is great. So, well, cool. Hey, once again, if you're interested in anything that we do, go to vulnercheck.com. We have the ability to do more advanced demos of our commercial products. You can access and try Vulnercheck KEV out. And then we'll plan on sending out a recording of this YouTube for afterwards, of the webinar recording, and we'll share that via LinkedIn. Sorry, LinkedIn Live didn't work for all those that made it over or watching this recording. Appreciate you being patient with us. And a special thanks to Anthony and Jacob for joining today. Clint for helping out on the chat. Like, that's always the best when you have someone taking care of comments as well. So thanks so much. And also thanks for the whole team working on this project and getting it out. We'll be excited to do more of these in the future, and look forward to sharing more knowledge as it relates to vulnerability intelligence, exploitation, and all things related to vulnerability threat intelligence.